Buonasera, credo che possiamo iniziare. Grazie di essere qui, adesso passo all'inglese, faccio una short introduction e poi dopo passo la parola al nostro ospite. So, welcome to this event on a such significant day when people in Italy took to the streets for Gaza and for peace. Today's lecture is organized by the new Institute Center for Environmental Humanities, NICHE, in collaboration with the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Heritage at Ca' Foscari University of Venice. I also welcome you on behalf of Professor Francesca Tarocco, the director of NICHE, who unfortunately cannot be with us, but sends her regards. My name, as many of you know, is Cristina Baldacci. I am an associate professor in history of contemporary art at the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Heritage and an affiliated faculty with NICHE, where I lead the Ecological Art Practices Research Cluster and the Art Ecology series, of which this event is a part. It is my privilege to introduce today's guest speaker, TJ Demos, although he needs no introduction, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with his outstanding work. TJ is undoubtedly one of the major points of reference for studies on the relationship between contemporary art, global politics, and ecology, as well as one of the most internationally engaged academic voices on environmental justice and the role that artistic practices can play in making visible, understanding, and addressing the socio-environmental crisis of our time. As a professor in the Department of the History of Art and Visual Culture at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and founder and director of its Center for Creative Ecologies, and most recently also a member of the Ecological Art Practices Research Cluster at NICHE, TJ has devoted his research and thinking to these issues for more than a decade now, publishing seminal books such as, starting from the most recent one, Radical Futurism, Ecologies of Collapse, Chronopolitics and Justice to Come, Beyond the World's End, Arts of Living at the Crossing, Against the Anthropocene, Visual Culture and Environment Today, and Decolonizing Nature, Contemporary Art and the Politics of Ecology. As can be seen from the titles of his monographs, TJ is committed to deconstructing dominant social, political, and economic conventions, in particular the narrative and aesthetics of the Anthropocene. His previous research, which was certainly already aimed at defining a counter-practice in art history and visual culture, laid to the foundations for his current thinking. I'm not only referring to the two publications he has devoted to other crucial topics for understanding our contemporary condition, namely migration and colonialism, and see the two books, The Migrant Image, The Art and Politics of Documentary During Global Crisis, and Return to the Post-Colony, Specters of Colonialism in Contemporary Art. But I also want to mention a seemingly unrelated publication, such as the monograph that TJ dedicated to Marcel Duchamp. With this study, he reinterpreted Duchamp's condition in the first half of the 20th century as one of exile, defining his gradual and radical exile from Europe at war and the art world as a form of personal and artistic resistance to the growing nationalism and capitalization of culture and society. I cannot conclude my brief introduction without referring back to this last point, especially on a day like today when a general strike on support of Gaza has been called in Italy, and therefore against the horrors of war and the growing violence exerted by technocratic neoliberalism on human beings and on the environment. Thank you. So it is therefore a great honor to host TJ Demos' lecture on the Tears of Justice, Contemporary Art and Environmental Violence, as a statement of all our community, ethical commitment as citizens, intellectuals, and also academics. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming TJ.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Christina. So I'd like to thank Cristina Baldacci, Professor Cristina Baldacci, for the kind invitation to come and speak. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. I'm really sorry that it coincided with the strike, because I would like to be part of the strike and join in solidarity with that important ongoing protest to the atrocity that's happening in Gaza as I speak. But of course, this event was planned long before we knew that this was going to happen today. So we decided, with a lot of consideration, to go ahead with it. And I think of it as in solidarity with Palestinian liberation. I'll talk about that. It will come up in about a third of my presentation will be about Palestine. So there is some connection. So as Christina mentioned, this is a talk that is a glimpse of a new research project that I'm working on, which looks at contemporary art as a site to think about and problematize the question of justice. So justice I'm thinking about in relation to environmental justice, climate justice, social justice more broadly. It's a term that I've relied on and used a lot in my past work. I think of my work in general as trying to make a case, trying to make an argument for justice in a lot of different ways. But I've never, looking back on that work, never really subjected this term to some critical scrutiny and thought more about what does it mean? What does it mean to talk about justice? What does it mean to refer to justice? And often to refer to justice as if it makes sense, as if we know what it means. When actually, when you start thinking about it and look into it, it's often very ambiguous. And not only is it ambiguous, often it represents the complete opposite of what you might think of as justice. So I'm very aware that this is a project that's taking on the problematic of justice at a time of arguably the systematic international perversion of justice. And I'm speaking as someone who's coming from the US, because what we're seeing in that context is the instrumentalization of justice in the name of its opposite, in the most horrendous ways. So the talk is in a way an attempt to deal with some of this density and complexity and difficulty. So I have a written text, but I'm not going to read it. I'm going to just talk through it, and maybe I'll read parts of it and see how that goes. So let me jump in. I'm going to look at 3 projects, but before I do that, let me start with this quote from Claudia Rankine, the African-American poet in the U.S. She says, "There is no justice," and she's thinking about the conflict between appeals to this sublime object of ethical truth. At least sometimes it's appealed to in that way, and the lived reality of injustice, of maybe it's a reflection on the impossibility of justice, ultimately, even as justice is invoked against conditions of violence and oppression and injustice. And she continues and she says, "There's no justice, there's just us." Her book is called Just Us, and it proceeds after this epigraph to go on and and talk about what this means exactly. And she's actually referring to a Richard Pryor joke that he made in the 1970s, where he said, this is an African-American comedian. He says, you go down, he's talking about the experience of black people going to a court, a legal court of justice, like as if they've been charged with a crime. So he says, you go down there looking for justice. That's what you find, just us. And he's referring to the overwhelming presence of black people in courts of justice, and making a joke about just us, and by extension, the impossibility or the contradiction of justice in that context. So this is I think is very inspirational and opens up immediately the problem of justice. I'll look at 3 projects that I'll talk about more. The first one is an image of this project. It's an artistic installation on the university campus where I teach. It's by Jackie Sumell in collaboration with Tim Young. It's called Solitary Garden. This is an image from 2019, soon after it was installed. It's a permanent installation on the campus, and I'll talk more about this. But what it basically represents, it's a project that an artist, Jackie Sumell, made in collaboration with a prisoner who's on death row, Tim Young. Although for the more than 20, at this point, more than 20 years that he's been on death row, he's pleaded innocence. And that's him that you see on the bottom right there. And they collaborated through correspondence, writing to each other, where Jackie Sumell proposed to reconstruct the dimensions of his prison cell, which you see in this image. So you have the exact footprint of the solitary confinement cell that he's spent more than 20 years in. So if he reaches out, he can touch both sides of the walls with his arms. And he spends up to 23 hours a day in that cell. And then in collaboration with him, he was invited to design a garden surrounding the solitary cell. And that's some of what you see here before lots more ended up growing in this area. So it's a collaboration about how he might imagine a form of emancipation that simultaneously reflects on the horror of solitary confinement and creates a space of in a way, botanical or garden, a kind of garden emancipation from the conditions of solitary confinement. So it's a project that draws on and is dedicated to abolition, meaning the political commitment to ending mass incarceration as we know it, that has come out of a long history in the US dedicated to ending anti-black slavery going back to the 19th century, that continues to this day in terms of policing, the very institutionally racist formations of policing and mass incarceration that people like Timothy Young are subjected to. So abolition is a term of social justice that refers to imagining a world without prisons. The second project I want to talk about is this one by Forensic Architecture, the London-based spatial politics research unit that looks at forms of environmental and also human rights injustices or abuses internationally. I'm going to focus on just one project, this one that's called Environmental Racism in Death Alley, Louisiana. It also refers to the US, where the forensic architecture team led by Imani Jacqueline Brown, who has family ties to this community of African-American people in this area that I'll talk about in Louisiana, and Samane Moafi, who are the lead researchers of this project that looks at how the history of plantation-based slavery has transmuted over time into a context of environmental racism, where you have the installation of petrochemical corporations that are polluting the lands, the air, and the water in this area where you have a high proportion of people, of African American people, who are descended from plantation-based slave ancestors. And so they're dealing with this continuity of how a form of racial injustice, that of slavery, transforms into environmental injustice that's also heavily racialized. And then the third project is the work of Vivien Sansour, the Palestinian artist and agricultural worker who has developed a couple projects I'll focus on in the last more than 10 years. Her Palestinian heirloom seed library and her traveling kitchens. You have a couple images of these projects on the screen here. The Palestinian heirloom seed library is a project where she is dedicating herself to saving heirloom seeds, or seeds that have an indigenous connection to the land and to Palestinian heritage in that part of the world, that are under threat from Israeli colonialism and the criminalization of forms of Palestinian agriculture, as well as foraging. So she's attempting to resist that form of control and that oppression by saving heirloom seeds, cultivating plants, growing them, harvesting them, and cooking food within her traveling kitchen for people who can come together, gather, enjoy foods of Palestine, and talk about Palestinian heritage and the conditions of the occupation at the same time. So again, this is a form of justice as a practice, as seeking forms of resistance to colonial erasure and oppression. So I'm going to talk about all of these projects. I'll just read one section here to set up the presentation. Each of these projects makes claims on justice. Forensic Architecture writes about their project. They say, quote, the black descendant, let's see, I have an image. The black descendant community has long voiced demands for accountability from the petrochemical corporations that occupy their lands. Today, this demand is building into a broader vision of justice, they write. So I want to ask, what is this justice? How does it enter into aesthetic form? How is it conceptualized and realized? How does it do so, especially today, in an era marked by proliferating legalized injustice, given the everyday brutalities of late racial fascism, the international normalization of ecocide and genocide in Gaza, in the face of which the global institutions of the modern liberal democratic order, say the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and along with them, the universality of human rights, appear to be collapsing. Justice itself is weeping, suspended between redress and endless deferral. Justice names oppression, but will it ever materialize within the state's colonial futurity? At least that's how some people put their critique of justice. That justice, because it inevitably appeals to the state. When we're talking about settler colonial states, that means appealing to the legal infrastructure of colonial futurity. So justice is in many ways a tear, at once an opening, a wound, and an expression of grief, if also a promise. It persists, however, in aesthetic form, collaborative in procedure, as both lament and proposition, gap and horizon, including, arguably, as an agreed-upon condition for Rankine's just us, to even have collective possibility. If so, if we're talking about just us, then how does art compose a collective? How is justice proceduralized in aesthetic play? Where and how does justice's conceptualization of demands and grievances and its proceduralization or juridification as process meet in aesthetic form? These are among the questions I want to ask in what follows. All right, so let me talk first about this project a bit more. This is a project that, as I mentioned, confronts the crisis of mass incarceration and the ways in which it's been heavily racialized. So there's a large disproportion of black people in US prisons compared to their numbers within the population. And in this sense, it is developing a really interesting and important approach to what we might call climate justice. Climate justice is something that people talk about often in terms of recognizing the fact that the causality behind climate is far from equal. Often it's the powerful developed countries and corporations that are responsible for climate breakdown. And similarly, the vulnerabilities of climate breakdown are differentially felt. So often those with the least resources have the highest degree of impact when it comes to climate vulnerability, whether within developed countries where you have concentrated areas of poverty, for instance, and people who are subjected to disproportionate proximity to toxicity and pollution, or between the global north and the global south, where the global south is often thought of as a freely available dump for the north's waste and toxic pollution. So in this sense, the piece is immediately developing, I think, a really important approach to this understanding of climate justice that is opening up these terms. So climate is not just a matter of talking abstractly about carbon in the atmosphere. It's rather referring to climates, for instance, of anti-blackness on the ground, within prisons, within institutionalized structures of injustice. This is a term here I'm drawing on Christina Sharp in her book In the Wake, where she talks about climates of anti-blackness. And it is referring to people who are talking about climates of apartheid. This is, for instance, the work of Olufemi Taiwo, who mentions this term, climates of apartheid. In other words, referencing the history of South African institutionalized segregation, but drawing comparisons to conditions in the States within racialized forms of segregation that you see in a context like this, between the incarcerated and those who are on the outside, as also a color divide. So if we think about climate in terms of a way that avoids the narrowness of techno scientific approaches and broaden it to the claims of social justice, then we can talk about anti-racist climates and ways of approaching justice from what we might call an intersectionalist perspective. Intersectionality is, of course, a pretty well-known and developed methodological approach to forms of oppression and also justice in the US. It goes back decades now. I don't know how common this is to use in the Italian context. Yeah, increasingly? Okay, so maybe you're familiar with this, but intersectionality insists on thinking different modalities of oppression together, whether it's race and class, or sexuality or ethnicity, and bringing them together within a complex analysis. So I think what we're seeing here is an intersectionalist approach to climate, where climate is not just about environmental breakdown and natural earth systems, but actually sociopolitical, economic, technological forms. So it is offering a really provocative conceptualization of ecology as intersectionality. If you stand you can enter this area if you visit the campus and the installation, and you can kind of look around and feel what it's like to be in this cell, even if it's a momentary, vicarious experience. But it does invite you to think about what this means to live in a place for over 2 decades, where this is your environment. The radical black political figure who was also incarcerated and ultimately murdered by the state, George Jackson, talks about how environments oppress people. People don't oppress environments. And he was thinking from within the context of a jail cell, which he likened to a land of tears. So I'm drawing on this to think about what it means to be in this context, referencing, as I mentioned, Christina Sharp's work, Climates of Anti-Blackness, and so on, in order to try to think about the conditions of this incredibly oppressive context that's dedicated to separating people from the natural environment. So if it's possible for us to imagine being in a small room for more than 2 decades and never seeing the sky, never feeling sunshine, never touching the ground outside of that coffin-like environment. So this is what George Jackson is talking about. Men are brutalized by their environment, not the reverse. And Olufemi Taiwo's piece on climate apartheid, these are important references from me. So when it comes to thinking about justice within mass incarceration and the legal context, an important point to consider this theorization further is the work of Derrida and his important essay back in 1992, where he wrote about what he called the force of law. I just want to reflect briefly on this because I think it's an important touchstone for ways of differentiating justice from law, right? This is a really crucial structural distinction to make. So for Derrida, law does not equal justice. And the relation between the two is ever complex. And this led to 3 different antinomies or contradictions that he viewed as foundational to conditions of justice. And I'm just referencing the emblem of the department, the U.S. Department of Justice there. Because, of course, it's in the name of the Department of Justice that you have mass incarceration and the subjection of people to forms of solitary confinement, which, according to other legal frameworks, for instance, the United Nations, this is considered a form of torture. It's a human rights abuse and a form of torture. So how is it that the U.S. Department of Justice can justify practices like this as a form of rendering justice? Well, this has everything to do with this distinction between law and justice, that law does not equal justice often. So for Derrida, these 3 antinomies or contradictions, the first one, he says, and I'm really crystallizing his complex argument here. He says, once codified into law, justice becomes mechanistic, inflexible. It becomes a calculation rather than a principle. So that's what we have increasingly with the seeming automation of legal decisions. And actually, we're also encountering the use of technology to do this and the use of AI to render legal decisions. So this is really something that Derrida wouldn't be thinking about in '92, but has come into fruition through the development of technology decades later. The automation of legality or the automation of justice through legality in this way of AI. The second one is Derrida proposed that when justice is instituted, it remains haunted by what he calls the ghost of the undecidable, determined by capricious subjective reasoning, detached from democratic accountability. So that's interesting. When justice is institutionalized, when a court of law renders justice, when a decision is made by a judge, it's haunted. That decision is always haunted by the ghost of the undecidable. Meaning, we can all ask, was that a just decision? Did that make sense? Was justice rendered? Or was it not? Was this a perversion of justice? Right? There's always this haunting that goes on. And in fact, other people have developed this argument and argued that the reason why courts of law exist is precisely because of the ambiguity of justice. Because there's ultimately a decision that needs to be made out of whether to institute this principle or that principle. So courts of law fundamentally, according to this kind of reading, are fundamentally oppressive. They're coercive, oppressive institutions. That are less rendering justice than choosing this justice over that justice. Okay, third, justice always gestures toward a future that's never fully present. Its fulfillment is endlessly deferred, and its urgency always unmet. So I think this is what Derrida would call justice to come. Justice is always to come. We never arrive at justice now. It's never delivered to us. We never feel like it's been delivered. This is maybe most evident when we're talking about when extreme violence occurs. Injustice is extreme violence, even death, right? For people who are murdered, there's no justice, and there never will be any justice. Justice is forever deferred, right? So this is something that, for Derrida, is a structural condition of justice. Moving on, more recently, Fred Moten has taken up some of these terms and developed them further in relationship to his theorization of justice, where he's talking about justice in terms of the juris generative. This is a principle that Moten is playing with that comes out of legal theory, specifically the work of Robert Cover, who's writing about this a few decades ago. Juris generative, so juris referring to justice or the principle of justice, where it's unclear whether that means law or justice, and then the generative, the creative, the constructive, so making more justice, more and more justice. This is what this term juris genesis or juris generative refers to. So Moten writes in this piece from 2013, what if it is in fact so full of laws that the imagination of necessity is constantly, fugitively in excess of itself, right? What if justice, given what Derrida was just talking about, what if justice is always in excess of itself? Well, that seems to be the case, right? And he goes on, law is never simply instituted, but insurgent, manifest, paralegally, criminally, fugitively, as a kind of ongoing anti-systemic break or breaking, including as a politico-aesthetic force that takes form in and as a contemporaneity of different times and the inhabitation of multiple possible worlds. Moten is thinking about jazz as he writes this, and thinking about musicality as a site of juris genesis. We could think of translating that theorization to the visual and aesthetic context. Jackie Sumell's Solitary Garden. What does it mean when you visit Solitary Garden and you think about abolition in relationship to your lived experience, in relationship to what you know about mass incarceration? to what you know of justice, right? Given the potential infinity of different responses to that question, you can get a sense that justice, similarly, is insurgent. It's continually manifesting new possibilities. There's no way to shut this down. It always draws into its equation a contemporaneity of different times and the inhabitation of multiple possible worlds. One way I want to think about this is through the term that I'm proposing, although other people have written about this, but it's abolition ecology. Abolition ecology is bringing together abolition as a political form of justice against anti-black slavery, against mass incarceration, against racial injustice, and ecology. And there's a few different potential theoretical roots of this term. One is abolition democracy by W.E.B. Du Bois. This is early 20th century, thinking about the necessity that abolition must also accompany democratization. When we're moving from a state of racial oppression and segregation, at its worst, slavery, to reconstruction, to post a transition beyond those conditions, it necessarily has to involve processes of democratization. Democratization that ultimately failed or were unfulfilled, looking back historically, especially from the context of the reactionary white supremacist present that we're finding in the US right now. The second term, abolition geography. Ruth Wilson Gilmore writes about freedom as a place. She writes about placemaking as a form of freedom-making, right? I think that's what's happening also in Solitary Garden, taking the horrific conditions of solitary confinement and turning it into freedom as a place. This is part of the insurgent justice-seeking of that project. And finally, to put abolition in relationship to ecology, there's a relation to all the plants and the insects and the forms of life that surround the garden and that are taking place in relationship to the garden and the prison. So multi-species, what would it mean to talk about multi-species justice as an inevitable development of the jurisgenerative principle? And here's someone like Donna Haraway, who's also my colleague at UC Santa Cruz, writes about multi-species justice. And I think we can bring that into the term of abolition ecology as a larger framework for how to think about justice in relationship to this piece. Looking at it and thinking about it visually, between, if you can imagine visiting it and look, it very much depends where you are when you visit it. It requires thinking about a situated perspective, whether you're on the outside looking into the prison cell or whether you're in the prison cell looking outward. And I want to think about this reversibility as a way to also draw the project into what's happening more broadly in relation to campus life and the conditions of oppression experienced on university campuses these days, especially in the last 2 years under the politics of Palestinian solidarity, as it's really surged within many college campuses, including UCSC, in solidarity with Palestinian liberation and against the genocide in Gaza. So I want to ask, what if we think about this piece, what if we reverse our viewpoint and the direction of Solitary Garden's carceral gaze, looking outwards instead of inwards, and see not a cell, a prison cell transformed into a garden, but a campus become a kind of prison? I think this is part of the generative possibility of this piece, that even though this was not anticipated or intended by the artist, it remains a possibility within the conditions of this creativity of the possibilities of social justice as we encounter it. And so here you see, I'm just pairing this brief glimpse of the the police shutting down the Palestinian Liberation Camp on the campus of UC Santa Cruz in the spring of 2024 at night. And you can see this was a very violent and oppressive event. But I think we get a glimpse of this. And we're invited to ask the question, are we, when we see this piece, are we looking at, do we get a brief glimpse of what it's like to be in solitary confinement in prisons? Or is this carceral logic being expanded to space in general, especially within the States, especially on university campuses these days? I know this is an old question. It goes back to, you could think of some of Foucault's work and others in the 70s. But this question has returned to us today with ever greater intensity and poignancy as we're experiencing the seeming systematic destruction of the university as we know it in the States, as a free space of inquiry, as a site of academic freedom, as a place of critical thinking, as a place of potential political solidarity. All of these things are being threatened in ways that most of us, I think, would never have guessed a few years ago. And yet, it goes back even further. If we wanted to do an archaeology of carceral logics and the way that plants and the more than human sometimes is recruited into a carceral logic, we can go back to, for instance, the early days of settler colonial planning. This is a photograph by the South African artist David Goldblatt, and it shows a remnant of a wild almond hedge in the Kirstenbosch area of outside of Cape Town in South Africa, planted in about 1660 as a way to keep indigenous African people outside of the settler colonial area. In other words, it's the instrumentalization of botany as a carceral force to protect property and segregate people from one another on the basis of racialized divisions. So I'm interested in this also in terms of not just abolition ecology in the more obvious ways, but also how abolition ecology allows insight. It allows a critical analytic frame to think about the mobilization of the carceral in all sorts of ways these days, including in border zones against migrants, the weaponization of heat or dryness or cold, depending on what we're talking about, what geographical area we're thinking about, as a way to as a form of deterrence or a potentially like deathly operation, like the transformation of the Mediterranean into a murderous site that's anti-migrant and xenophobic. If you look at this piece and think about aesthetic conditions, you might, if you're art historically inclined, relate some of the vocabulary here back to maybe the 60s, minimalism. It's a very kind of minimalist vocabulary, of course transformed into a prison cell. But within the discourse of minimalism, and here I'm getting a little specific about art history theory, minimalism has long been, it was criticized at the time for, there were claims made that minimalism was post-anthropocentric. It wasn't about the human body. It wasn't about like sculpture that was portraiture, and it wasn't about landscape. It was something else. It was about the specific objects, conditions of minimalism. And yet, critics pointed out that there's still a kind of haunting of the human figure that goes along with these objects. And I think that that's true. There is a kind of haunting within this context especially, where we're haunted by the absent presence of Timothy Young, whose cell this is, right? And so Timothy Young is always, in a way, there and not there at the same time. Ultimately, I want to argue in this piece that Timothy Young, if he's there, if he's present as an absence, it's also a form of transformation. There is a kind of anti-anthropocentric logic that is happening here in aesthetic terms. It's as if Timothy Young, as a prisoner, is emancipated from human form and has become the form of life that's surrounding the prison cell. It's a kind of, say, freedom dream that Timothy Young writes about. He says, and this is one of the letters that he wrote to people who correspond with him, and that was possible to do up until a few years ago, and then it was the prison at San Quentin in California stopped allowing this. He said, I pictured myself at the Solitary Garden on the UC Santa Cruz campus. I sat on the bench and I overlooked the garden in solitude. I meditated. I walked around the structure, taking in the panoramic splendor of all the flowers and plants. Again, this is a place he's never seen or visited. And then he writes, and then I did what I've been dreaming of for so long. I squatted down and felt the earth. I picked up the soil and let it sift through my hands. It has been 21 years. So now it's been 26 years today that he has not felt the soil. So again, this is a kind of freedom dream that is not, I think, I would argue, it's not an escape from reality. It's not a kind of justice that is escapist or elusive or a matter of just utopian imagination. This is a form of survival within conditions of unimaginable brutality and oppression. So how can we think about justice as a form of embodied sensory multi-species imagination? Moving on, my second case study is this project by Forensic Architecture, Environmental Racism in Death Alley. And this is from the project's website. And I have an arrow here pointing just to call attention to the way that Forensic Architecture is dating this project. They date it from 1718 to ongoing. In other words, they're very self-consciously referring back to centuries of forms of injustice, including, as I mentioned, the conditions of plantation slavery, and the way that has formed a continuum with the environmental racism that takes place today within the same area. So this is a project that was made in collaboration with an environmental justice and anti-racist social justice organization called Rise St. James. They're a faith-based grassroots organization fighting for environmental justice in this area. As I mentioned, many of these people are related to or descendants from enslaved people that were once living in the same area under conditions of slavery. And now they're faced with a different kind of oppression, which is the oppression of environmental, corporate, industrial toxicity that's polluting their bodies and subjecting them to premature death, forms of oppression that they can't or are unable to escape or don't want to escape, either for class, economic reasons, they can't afford to live elsewhere, or they don't want to abandon their homes, their multi-generational places of residence. Forensic architecture analyzes these conditions and the way that toxic emissions from these petrochemical corporations you see on the bottom right here, this petrogeography that is just bordering the Mississippi River. And these are all areas that were once plantations, has created conditions of incredible environmental and health crises. And what forensic architecture does beyond measuring the conditions, analyzing the cancer risks from toxicity, doing all sorts of, using technology in all sorts of ways to measure the spread of these toxic emissions to different communities. They and at the same time attempt to find what they call these topographical anomalies, these areas where there's a density of trees and bushes that remain after hundreds of years, that haven't been cut down, even though some of them have. And it turns out what these indicate are historical traces of cemeteries of enslaved people. So there are areas that were never utilized within plantations to grow crops because it was necessary to have places dedicated to the burial of enslaved people. And these areas have, many of them have persisted even though corporations and the state has lost track of where they are. And so by analyzing topography, bringing current geographical areas in connection with historical cartography and comparing them, forensic architecture is able to find these anomalies and aid grassroots organizations that are trying to get them declared as heritage sites. And by doing this, it serves a double purpose in the name, again, of justice. But two ways are brought together here in really like a fascinating a project. On the one hand, it's about reclaiming Black heritage and identifying cemeteries of ancestors of people. So there's a racial justice component. The other is that by getting these cemeteries protected as heritage sites, it can stop petrochemical corporations from expanding. So racial justice and Black heritage converge with environmental justice and the protection of land that are operating at the same time according to an intersectionalist logic within this jurisgenerative framework of seeking justice in really fascinating ways. This is occurring with current project. This is an ongoing project in this area between Baton Rouge and New Orleans and Louisiana. For instance, Formosa Plastics, this is a massive multinational petrochemical corporation, is currently right now proposing a $9.4 billion project in this area that would heavily impact Black communities that are living in the vicinity. And so this is part of the unfolding of a process of attempting to locate historical cemeteries or sacred groves in the proposed footprint of Formosa Plastics development project in order to stop this expansion from taking place. And so it's really an amazing project in that sense. And I'd like to talk about it in two different ways. One is that clearly forensic architecture is operating within conditions of state law. Like to get heritage sites recognized, there's a kind of what we could call a juridification from below. Working with grassroots communities and trying to put pressure on the law to recognize their justice, their conception of racial and environmental justice, instead of courts of law and legal systems from operating from above, a kind of juridification from above that generally supports ruling class interests, corporate interests, economic elite interests. So there's a contest here in how justice seeking is being directed. So juridification from below is one way to look at that. But I don't think that's the only way of understanding it. There's also a really important, ambitious unleashing of justice from the framework of the state and the corporation that is also occurring at the same time here. And this is why I think this is a particularly interesting FA or forensic architecture project. They write, through the lens of the petrochemical plantation burial ground, Death Alley is revealed as a 300-year continuum of environmental racism. So I've explained that. But they go on, they say, Death Alley refuses the narrow metrics of the law. and instead offers a speculative jurisprudence rooted in Black life, loss, and futurity, premised on reparations for centuries of racial violence, environmental restoration, community-sustaining jobs, a moratorium on industrial development, and self-determination over land stewardship, as is articulated in their project. So in other words, all these different components gather energy as this process of jurisgenerative flourishing takes place, transcending the limits of state institutions of justice. One way to understand this is that justice seeking becomes a world-building project. Again, it's not something that ends up reaffirming oppressive legal institutions or attempting to disrupt them, but at the same time staying within them. It's also radically expands the horizons of what justice can be. And I want to put this in relation to this term world-building project. It's a term that I'm drawing from Femi Taiwo's work and his book, Reconsidering Reparations. And he writes, if slavery and colonialism built the world and its current basic scheme of social injustice, the proper task of social justice is no smaller. It is quite literally to remake the world. And he makes this argument across the pages of this book, I think in really important ways, where you can see that world building, to think about justice as a world building project, helps us escape from the potential problems of working for social justice within unjust social institutions. Okay, there's lots more to say here, but I'm going to move on just to make some progress here. The third and the last case study, also very complex and lots to say here, is Vivien Sansour's work, which I showed you already. The Palestinian Heirloom Seed Library is based in this area of Palestine, Batir. It's just outside of Jerusalem, but in the West Bank. This is just a shot that shows you what this area is like. It's a World Historical Heritage Site. In this sense, Sansour's work is developing practices of Palestinian attempts to return to the land and return to making a connection, reconnecting with the land that is in threat in all sorts of ways, most obviously and horrifically in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, including not only over the last 100 years, but also in the last 2 years, as the situation in the West Bank, settler violence, has been incredibly exacerbated by what's happening in Gaza. I want to put Sansour's work in relationship to other artists. There's many who are working also in relationship to this kind of project of reconnecting Palestinian life with Palestinian land. For instance, the work of Jumana Mana, her somewhat recent film Foragers from 2022 is a look at how Palestinians are refusing to stop collecting indigenous species of plants, Palestinian plants, specifically plants like akub and zatar, really important for the Palestinian culinary practices. Even though collecting these plants has been actually criminalized by the Israeli colonial state, so that Palestinians who collect plants can be charged with crimes, can be fined, can be arrested, can be jailed, simply for picking plants like akub. Akub is a kind of like artichoke-like plant that, as Palestinians in the film explain, requires cultivation. If you don't pick them, then they die, right? Whereas according to the Israeli logic, if you pick them, you're contributing to their endangerment. So there's a kind of biopolitics, a struggle of the status of life and what life, in terms of the more than human realm, what it represents in relationship to Palestinian belonging that is occurring here. A biopolitics or maybe a necropolitics. in terms of the imposition of these death worlds on Palestinian people. So Sansour and her seed library, her traveling kitchen, is specifically attempting to counter this, to think about the seed as a protagonist within this struggle. Seeds are Palestinian. They're a site of connection to the land. They're a way of establishing belonging to the territory. They're a way of thinking about Palestinian life. Palestinian people, according to Vivien Sansour, are seeds also. People are seeds. Seeds are also, they take on what we could call a relation to chronopolitics, or the politics of time. Seeds are futurity. Seeds represent a bridge between the past, ancestral heirloom seeds, Palestinian history, Palestinian heritage, and Palestinian futurity. So they're a way of time traveling. They're a chronopolitical, biopolitical form of life in Palestinian-ness that Sansour talks about in really amazing ways. She says, these seeds carry the DNA of our survival against a violent background that is seen across the hills and valleys through settlement and chemical input expansions. She wrote that a while ago, before 2023. So she's thinking about seeds not only as insurgent forms of resistance to settler colonization, but also insurgent forms of resistance to chemical monocrop-based agriculture. Right? Increasingly, foods are imported to feed Palestinian people, when, as a way of a form of control to keep them from their lands and from cultivating their lands. So she says the seed serves as a catalyst to bring forth a conversation about our bioheritage, and engages people to take a deeper look into their personal stories and their relationship to what they eat. So when you sit down, if you're able ever to participate in one of her traveling kitchen events, and these happen not only in Palestine but also internationally, as she travels, you're invited to have this kind of conversation as you're enjoying Palestinian foods, or as you participate in gardening and planting Palestinian seeds internationally. So the seed serves as a catalyst to bring forth a conversation. That's what people do within the traveling kitchens. These are sites of discursive production, storytelling, as well as materializing Palestinian futurity through planting these seeds. I want to think about the seeds as a form of survival media. And here I have in mind the work of Suvendrini Pereira, who writes about survival media in the Sri Lankan context, another context of genocide, of the destruction of the Tamil minority over the last decade. She writes of survival media in this book as acts of improvised transmutations, enforced improvisations in zones of conflict, forms of cultural politics, corporeal poetics, and their material effects. So some people might think that it's problematic or impossible or ethically challenged to think about art within the context of genocide or extreme forms of violence. Pereira is arguing that, well, that's only if we maintain certain very restricted understandings of what art is. If we open that up and think of art as a form of creative world building that is available to all humanity, then we can find these expressions of survival media or the aesthetics of world building as an insurgent form of resistance, an anti-colonial, anti-genocidal inscription in all places, including in solitary confinement cells on death, with death row prisoners who are refusing to give up the possibilities of what art as a form of survival media might mean, right? It's not a privileged form. It's something that Timothy Young, in his solitary confinement cell, even right now, thinks about as a way of surviving. Similarly, it has happened and is continuing to happen in Gaza. And I'm just very quickly showing you a few examples of this, what this could mean. Grandmothers, for instance, collecting debris and knitting clothing in order to help children and themselves stay warm in winter under conditions of extreme privation owing to the Israeli siege on Gaza. Or Palestinians in Gaza writing the names of the dead buried in the rubble underneath these very concrete blocks, where they're writing this kind of poetry of resistance and insistence on survival and remembrance and grieving despite all, right? Or forms of foraging and growing foods whenever, wherever possible. These, I would argue, are all forms of survival media. It's true, Vivien Sansour's work is not in Gaza. Rather, it's in the West Bank. It's in other kinds of conditions of massive oppression, of apartheid, of segregation, of these kinds of oppressive architectural forms of separation and segregation, of the biopolitics of control, of surveillance, of the use of AI, and the endless checkpoints and militarization, the restrictions, and all of the rest of it. But it's on a continuum, as so many people suggest, with the even more horrendous conditions that have been occurring in Gaza. Not only over the course of the near 20-year siege and blockade, but over the last 100 years of what Rashid Khalidi calls Israel's 100 Years War on Palestine, but especially over the last unprecedented 2 years of genocide and ecocide, which includes the destruction of Palestinian conditions of livability. So as people have pointed out, Israel has not only targeted people systematically with AI targeting software supplied by US corporations who have benefited enormously from these conditions. So Silicon Valley and the tech industry is heavily complicit, as is many US institutions, German institutions worldwide, but especially in the US, including universities. And this raises an extremely important point about what it means to work within contradiction and address these kinds of problems of what it means to work in a university like the University of California, whose economic resources are invested in asset managing firms like BlackRock and Vanguard that are invested in profiting from the genocide. This is what students have been speaking up about. One thing, demanding divestment from those corporations that are profiting from this, insisting that University of California, for instance, or Harvard, or Columbia, or Brown, or Northwestern, or many other universities in the US divest from the economy of genocide. But also, Israel at the same time has systematically targeted the more than human, agricultural fields, greenhouses, animals, water sources, the air, soil, right? Destroying conditions of livability and reproducibility within Gaza. Recently, this is an article from July 31st, so just a few weeks ago, 2025, a report that Israeli forces demolish the seed multiplication unit of UAW seed bank in Hebron. This is in the West Bank. So the IDF or the IOF is targeting actual sites of Palestinian seed collection. This isn't Vivien Sansour's work or library, but it's one that's even more important as an institutional site of Palestinian seed heritage, specifically targeted by Israel. So there's a continuum between what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank. In Gaza, there are people like Vivien Sansour who have been growing foods, sharing it freely, like Hamada Shakura, the Gaza Soup Kitchen, Mrs. Naja's Kitchen, Mohammed Kamsan, many more. These are some of the people who have been doing everything within their power to grow food and to freely share it within collective soup kitchens or food distribution sites to people who have been suffering this engineered famine, these horrific conditions. And it also includes people like Mohammed Almadoun and Yusuf Abu Rabea and Medu Halimi, who have been killed, targeted by the IOF because they're participating in resistance and sharing food, growing vegetables over the last 2 years. There's more ways to talk about this, and I get into like what are the conditions of injustice? If Vivien Sansour is addressing, in some ways, the realizations of justice, what is she struggling against? One useful site for me to analyze this, although it predates the current Gaza genocide, is the work of Lara Shehi and Stephen Shehi. It's a book called Psychoanalysis Under Occupation: Practicing Resistance in Palestine. And they write, life under settler colonial Zionism is a matter of crushing and lasting psychological damage and trauma, where the occupation is experienced psychosomatically through sensations of asphyxiation, slow death, and psychic annihilation. It's not dissimilar to how people in solitary confinement describe their conditions also, but it's different. Manifesting in physical illness and mental distress, owing to the long-term internalization of systemic violence. This is over years, over decades, right? And they analyze this in their book. They write, so what they call for is a methodology of the oppressed, and they're developing this within psychoanalysis, which is fascinating. So they call for mobilizing psychoanalysis as a form of repair work that wields emotional, symbolic, and somatic tools to create counter-technologies of liberation, including at the psychophysical level, that enable the oppressed to reclaim agency through embodied collective practices of healing and resistance, to decolonize the imagination, to refuse to die. And as you can imagine, the work of Frantz Fanon is really important to their project. Another modeling of anti-colonial psychoanalysis developed in the late 50s, early 1960 in the Algerian context against French colonization. So I think this is exactly what Vivien Sansour's work offers, if you will, a counter-technology of liberation, a kind of embodied social justice. Her work, and here's another image on the right from her traveling kitchen, it's not an appeal to, certainly to settler colonial institutions of justice or legality. It's rather developing the conditions of what justice can mean informally by eating together and talking about what justice means, right? It's a kind of juridification from below. It's a way to decolonize the imagination. It's a kind of collective care where anyone and everyone is invited into this space to talk about what justice might mean in the larger context of genocide and ecocide. Okay, so wrapping up, I'll just read this last part, and then if you have any questions, I'm really interested in hearing what you think and responding to any questions that you might have. So these practices, these three practices, and this is just, again, this will be a small part of what I imagine will be a book project. These are three practices out of many that we could talk about. But these practices refuse to surrender the concept of justice, at least not in the meaning-making terms of their experimental forms. They unleash jurisgenesis in a politico-aesthetic creativity that, blossoming in the work's form, generates new meanings of justice while simultaneously undoing its capture by institutional authority. So in this sense, I want to explore more how justice as a site of jurisgenesis could be structurally compared to, or even is continuous with, aesthetics as a site of jurisgenesis. Aesthetics is a site of meaning-making that is similarly potentially infinite and can't be clamped down on. Right, so this process of justice making de-reifies objectification, working against the containment of justice as law or order or policy. Containment here is the work of counterinsurgency. When we contain justice, we're participating in counterinsurgency, I would argue. Before I go on, I forgot this slide. This slide is in the wrong place. I keep forgetting to mention this. Let me just pause there for a second. I want to register the fact that not everyone supports the use, not everyone on the left, coming from an anti-colonial, even anti-capitalist position, supports the term justice. Right? This is not the term of choice for a lot of people. For instance, Yves Tuck and Wayne Yang, these are people who have contributed a lot to indigenous anti-colonial discourse, decolonization. They are very wary of justice's so-called colonial temporality. For them, appealing to justice means appealing to state institutions. And these are just two quick examples. Another is Dionne Brandt, the African-American poet, who thinks of her work as writing against tyranny and toward liberation. And she says she doesn't believe in justice. Justice offers a fiction of that's desired and delayed by the self-legitimizing narratives of legitimacy that conceals tyranny. She says in so many words. So justice is a facade. It enables tyranny by giving a fiction of redemption. Okay, sorry, I'm going to go back. So when we try to contain justice, it may be the work of counterinsurgency, performed not just by the police or prison guards in executing unjust laws. For instance, here, this is the University of California, UCLA, where the police are raiding, along with tear gas, the Palestinian Solidarity Camp on May 2nd, 2024, to shut it down extremely, violently. So it's performed not just by police or prison guards, but also increasingly within arts and educational institutions. This is counterinsurgency. By the guardians of meaning, of what can be said and shown when and where. Museum curators, university administrators, professors even, who can and often act as cultural enforcers of ruling ideas, agents of anticipatory obedience, given permission by and within a more and more authoritarian political environment. This is what we're dealing with today. The deplatforming of artists, the clearing of encampments by militarized police, even the collaboration with ICE deportation, this ICE anti-migration police in the States, of dissenters and non-citizens, are not anomalies in this sense. They reveal the deep complicity of liberal institutions in upholding the current order that some are defining as emergent forms of fascism. So this term, the F word, is, I think, rightly so, increasingly becoming important, and it's being thought in very intelligent ways by a number of people. I'm thinking of, just off the cuff, the work of Alberto Toscano and his book, Late Fascism, I think makes an important case for how we can think about fascism in a non-analogical way. This means, for Toscano, releasing ourselves from the seeming imperative to always compare and measure fascism by its relation to Nazi Germany or Italian fascism of the early 20th century, right? For Toscano, and he's building off the work of people like George Jackson and Angela Davis and others, the US has its own specific indigenous history of fascism that began hundreds of years ago with anti-black slavery, with indigenous genocide. Right? So it's really important to think about how we can mobilize this term, late fascism or racial fascism, given what's happening today with the ascendancy of maybe Christo-fascist white supremacy in the States right now. So this complicity, in conclusion, and I'm concluding now, reveals more than a reactionary tendency. For a growing number of critics, it lays bare the bankruptcy of foundational liberal values, which appear crumbling in the face of racialized violence and environmental devastation, while post-Enlightenment liberal capitalism's origins within colonialism and racism were always torqued in contradiction. Nowhere is it currently more visible than in the ongoing genocide in Gaza, supported across mainstream political partisan lines by international and especially US political elites and fueled by profiting tech and weapons industries. In such a moment, a retreat, and I think this is the argument I want to make, a retreat from fascist jurisprudence to liberal neutrality or proceduralism offers no refuge, only more tears and tears of justice, more deeper betrayals. So the response, I argue, can only be mass political struggle. But art in this context is not peripheral, but deeply relevant, or at least it can be. Some forms of art can be. It can be relevant to this world-building project, providing open space for radical reimaginings of justice, speculative, ecological, collective. Its expressions help us proliferate not only claims for climate justice, but claims of justice themselves, but climates of justice themselves, atmospheres of care, solidarity, and collective resistance that could, if sustained, help transform the very institutions that govern life. So here again, if we're thinking about art as a world-building project. In the capitalist ruins of the present, without any guarantees, these practices plant the seeds of a freer world. Thank you.
So TJ, thank you so much for this very rich presentation. I want to open up the discussion immediately because we have just a few more minutes, 20 minutes more or less, and make the conversation now collective. But I really thank you especially for presenting 3 case studies that have a lot to do also with Venice, with environmental issues that we also have in Venice, and 3 case studies that have a lot to do also with artistic practices that are, let's say, that we have here in Venice. So, and thank you also for this last definition of art as, let's say, that centers again art inside the humanities and inside the environmental humanities, not just as a form of utopia, but as you said, as a form of survival. Please, since we have here a lot of colleagues, scholars, students also, who are all dealing and working on many of the issues you brought at the table, who wants to break the ice with a question? Marco, maybe introduce yourself when yeah. And there is a mic, yeah.
So my name is Marco. I am a research fellow here at Ca' Foscari. And I was wondering if in your mapping of the concept and notion of justice, you, for example, analyze some non-state self-government forms. For example, I was thinking about the Kurdish experiment of democratic confederalism, in which, for example, as far as I remember I recently read an article where there was a Kurdish lawyer debating how in the southeastern Turkey they think about justice. It was interesting because they use the term justice, and their system of self-government is as justice as its goal, but it's divorced from law, because for them law is immediately related to the central state of Turkey and all the racist with all its racist and political connections. So this is the first question. Or maybe also what kind of concept of justice, for example, the Zapatistas use if they use one. Yeah, and this is the first thing. The other thing is just something that came to my mind when I was looking at the prison cell project. It reminded me also of an Italian work by an Italian artist whose name is Rossella Biscotti, and the project is The Trial, which I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's something similar. So she recreated the space of the courtroom in which the famous trial of the 7th of April was held, and she recreated the space using concrete blocks as a cast of the courtroom. So in a way also somehow pointing to some kind of, let's say, minimalistic or brutalist aesthetics. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I do know that work, and have actually written about it a little bit, but years ago, actually. I haven't thought about it in relation to this project or how she mobilizes the term justice, especially in relationship to some of the radical politics in Italy in the 70s and 80s. I think that she's dealing with at that time, right? So I can't answer it specifically, but I think it's a really provocative question to think about, and maybe I'll go back and look at that and see if the term comes up or it was made at stake at all in her work. Maybe it was. I'm not sure offhand, but yeah, you're right in seeing some comparison to the use of concrete in the minimalist forms in its presentation. In terms of the first part about the Kurds and the Zapatistas, again, I can't like answer it because I'm not sure offhand. But it is the kind of question that I am asking, maybe in slightly different contexts. Like within the states, there are indigenous nations and organizations who have their own understanding of justice and even legality that is not at all identical to or not sourced within colonial institutions. So that would be something that I want to follow up and think about. I know some communities, like the work of one writer who writes about the Anishinaabe. There's an indigenous group in the U.S. and Canada. Leanne Simpson simply rejects the term justice. So she believes like indigenous traditions have their own approaches to what some people might think of as justice. And so she's looking at that. The Kurds are a really interesting case, of course. I've been interested in the work of Öcalan and his connection to Murray Bookchin. I realize he's only one example. There's lots of other writings and important figures within the Kurdish political resistance movement. But his way of bringing together social justice, political autonomy, non-state forms of confederalism, and relations to social ecology. Like thinking about Murray Bookchin, who's a U.S.-based social, a theorist and activist from the 60s and the 70s. He was mainly writing about social ecology. But the way Öcalan brings all this together within the Kurdish context is extremely interesting. And you're right in bringing that up. I think it is interesting, given the Kurdish resistance to, let's say, statism as an emancipatory project, right? We have to think beyond the state. But what would that, I'm just thinking with you right now, that what would that mean for the question of justice? If we're really committed to an anti-statism, is it possible, is it desirable to retain the term justice? I don't know, but I think that's a great suggestion. It's much of it is similar with the Zapatistas, who are very much developing their own indigenous form of life within the Mexican, the South Mexican state of Chiapas. And again, I'm not sure if they're thinking about this term justice, but quite possibly. I'm interested in Latin American philosophies of what's called buen vivir, or the good life, or summa causa, you know, these terms that come out of Quechuan indigenous philosophies of a non-Western, non-individualist, communal form of living together as a place of ecological and social well-being and political emancipation that shows up in some of Zapatismo, the ideas of Zapatismo, Zapatismo-ismo. So I'll have to look into that further. Thank you.
Thank you very much for many discovery. I have just the impression from the second case study and the question about the third case study. In terms of New Orleans, you know, the Louisiana air pollution, I'm interested in the internal colonialism theory that was developed in the year 50s and 60s through a black civil rights movement. And it was very developed after the Mexican socialist Pablo González Casanova. He wrote an article about the internal colonialism and national development. Because I'm saying that because in Japan, in the inland sea, there are many islands that were exploited by big city because they constructed a copper smelting plant so that to avoid the air pollution from, for example, the Japan's second economic pole, that is Osaka. And they also, in these days, recently, they try to throw away the waste. So some people start to avoid this. Some people established the museums. So it took us, for example, one of the Japanese artists, Yanagi, he constructed a contemporary art museum to avoid, of course, this kind of treatment. Internally, it's the internal colonialism. It's a kind of power structure. And another example is Minamata disease in the southern part of Japan. Also, all the fishermen, they suffered. They still continue the trial. But the chief of this movement said, it's really the power structure, and everybody can be victim. Also, everybody can make, produce this kind of power. So I'm very interested in also Louisiana's case because I think you said that resilience as the resistance through community and through people. We can make change, I suppose, I think personally. And the third case, the seed is really a germ, it's concentrated of life, and I'm very touched by this story. And in Syria, during the conflict, they sent the seeds to a seed bank in, I think it's Sweden or Norway. And because in Aleppo, the seed bank which was destroyed, so they transferred seed. So I don't know if in Palestine, this kind of transfer of seed to preserve the heritage, both national and agricultural, heritage. I hope it can be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that your comments and question. I don't know offhand. That's a good question. And in fact, I showed a brief clip, a brief still of the artist Jumana Mana and her film Foragers. She made a previous film, you may know it, called Wild Relatives, that was about the Syrian case and the transfer of seeds, or the withdrawal of seeds from Svalbard, which is Norway, from the seed bank, right, to bring back to Syria after the civil war. The film's called Wild Relatives. It's really good about that transfer. I don't know, I can't maybe respond very much to your question. It was a very complicated question about, you began with internal colonialism, which is a really important historical discourse in the States, that this is something, as you said, that African American people, political theorists and activists were arguing and trying to make a case for in the 1960s and 70s, that the black community, the black population in the U.S. was a colonized population, and that they should have a liberation movement that leads to a national state. So it's a kind of like an independence movement for black national state formation in the U.S. That's kind of fallen away. That the politics, it was heavily subjected to repression by the FBI. I've just been reading about this coincidentally. There's a book, I'm reading Robin Kelly's book, Freedom Dreams, where he deals with some of that history of the internal colonization theory. It's interesting to think about like Japan in that context in terms of internal colonization. I hadn't come across this, not that I know very much about the Japanese context. I do know about Minamata and some of the things that, of course, the U.S. military sites also in Osaka and other areas in Japan are forms of external colonization, you might say. But in terms of internal colonization of indigenous people in Japan, I think that's really interesting to make those connections.
It's not indigenous, just a question of peripheric area and central area.
Okay, central periphery.
Yeah, it's the same origin.
Okay.
It's a kind of power relations
Yeah.
between the economically superior region and just peripheric area.
Yeah, interesting. But it could be a case, again, that supports the need to think about emancipatory struggles outside of the state formation, or new ways of thinking about internal colonization. There's been a lot of discussion recently about the so-called boomerang effect. This term has come back, this term of Aimé Césaire, anti-colonial theory in the mid-20th century, right? The idea that states colonize over there, but then the kind of military violence that they establish over there makes its way back home. And we're definitely seeing this. There's been waves of this in the States, also in Europe. I'm thinking a lot about the States these days because of what's happening. But people have made arguments that when the U.S. Did what they did in Vietnam, the war on Vietnam from the U.S., those forces came back to the States and ended up militarizing society, bringing all this kind of violence back into the States. We're seeing that very much so today. It's another wave of the boomerang effect. So yeah, I think that this term internal colonization is maybe, we can multiply it and think about it in complex ways historically.
Yeah, I think it's the same structure, but the thing is just they produce this constructed art museums, contemporary art museums, that help to revitalize and this island.
Yeah, thank you. But just to bring it back to justice, so Olufemi Taiwo's work, I think, is really interesting in this sense, reconsidering reparations, because he's thinking about reparations as a world-building project. And once you have that framework, it makes a lot possible. Like, should we have a state? Maybe we need to think about the state form in more of a, people have been doing this for a long time, but maybe we need to rethink these conditions. Maybe the U.S. needs a constituent assembly. Maybe California needs to secede from the states. All these questions become possible when you start to think about justice as a world-building project. And then we can think about whether justice is like substantial or whether it's constructivist. Does justice mean anything? Or is it always historically and culturally situated? This is also a big question. I think, and this answering your question allows me just to say this last thing, which is that I really support procedural justice. We need institutions and practices of justice making, and that requires diverse input and participation. So we can't have a center determining what justice is, and then the periphery is subjected to that. We have to have procedural, redistributive forms of justice in practice.
Yes, a dissemination of justice, I would say.
Yeah.
Mm. Is there another question?
Yeah, hi. I do have a question, kind of. I'm Vitska. I'm now a free-roaming curator and para-academic, perhaps, I don't know, and a recently arrived resident to Venice. Thanks, TJ. I was interested in your propositioning of the term abolition ecology and its overlap with Ruth Wilson Gilmore's abolition geography. And back last year at Buck, we had the good fortune of engaging in a few conversations with Ruthie, and in the context of, quite a extensive project I convened with Marwa Asanios. And we had a discussion precisely on environmental and social dispossession. And Ruthie, she talks indeed about abolition geography as solidarities of placemaking across geographies. But I think seeing the juxtaposition of those two terms, I thought, well, hey, I understood abolition geography to be of a kind of transformative project, which is also about ecology and our relation to Earth and our the rewriting of that script, that necropolitical script that dispossesses. So I was wondering if you could maybe you did already, of course, expand upon abolition ecology, but I was curious to see how you see that distinction between the two.
It's, I suppose, a different kind of emphasis, but it's. I would reiterate, it's heavily indebted to her work, to abolition geography. If we think about geography encompasses ecology. I think, right? We can't have geography without ecology, maybe, I would probably say. So it's just a switch of emphasis in order to bring out the ecological element and as a result, connect to the discourse within the environmental humanities and people thinking more about climate and environment and ecology in a more systematic way. I'm not the first to propose this term. It's already out there. But I have found it useful to think with it as a proposition. If there's a difference from abolition geography, it's not that abolition ecology would turn back and somehow offer a critique of abolition geography. It's more like maybe mobilizing a part of abolition geography to think more about, say, multi-species ways of being and things that are more directly connected, as I said, to climate and environment. Terms I also want to deconstruct and broaden and make expansive. So I like this, this phrasing that Fred Moten develops of the jurist generative. It's a kind of generation of terms and terminologies, not necessarily to insist on choosing this or that, but maybe it invites methodologically a place where we can put our energy and connect, and thereby connect to a different kind of discourse, as well as to Ruth Wilson Gilmore's writings also.
I think there is time for one last question or two quick ones.
I guess my question is revolving around the concept of generative and jurist generative on two levels. One, going back to the 4 points you made by Jacques Derrida. One of them was about you know, what is legal and what is being generated, right? For example, what the Department of Justice is currently generating in the US. So generative can take on, you know, the good and the bad as far as qualities go. And generative is just really a progression, kind of, which leads me to another thing. I've been struggling with it as a term. I'm a master's student here in the environmental humanities working on a thesis. And it almost has like a neoliberal sort of foundation. It still fits in this kind of binary of time and cycles, history, that is this sort of, we're going forward and we're developing better forward. When I spoke, I actually attended in New Orleans this equinox, actually, exactly a year ago today. It was a ritual that was being done at an art installation in New Orleans called Nani Bulbancha, which is created by a collective of indigenous people who don't all call themselves artists per se. It's based on the shell mounds, and they created this shell mound in the Lafitte Greenway, which is a really important neighborhood in New Orleans in honor of the shell mounds that have lasted forever. And one of the women, she's an indigenous woman, she's Huma, and she's a scholar, and she was talking about, I just felt like it captures it in such a simple way, undoing colonialism and undo the things that need to be undone by doing culture, and for them, doing their own culture, and how Nani Bulbancha was such a manifestation, a materialization of that for them, and really important. And I'm just curious if these same theorists who are having issues with justice per se, if there's any conversation around this use of generative, which is a very popular term that I run across a lot, but I do struggle with. So.
Thank you. Yeah, the generative, I would agree with you in terms of the juris generative, is value-free, right? It doesn't mean it's good or it's bad, the kind of principles that it's producing or creating, right? It can go in either direction. So the Department of Justice is juris generative. Even though many of us, or hopefully all of us, would have problems with the kind of justice that it's producing. I'm not sure what you meant by it's like neoliberal, the way I'm using it or the way it's often understood?
The way it gets used a lot, not necessarily the way you've used it, which is why I kind of wanted to identify if your use of it is in this way. There's a lot of sort of socio-political conversation around being generative versus not, something else is degenerative. These sort of categorical ways of using this term as a good and a bad, and using generative as this sort of good thing always. And it becomes like unsituated.
Yeah.
And it's dangerous to me, I think.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying that that's what you're doing. I'm asking about the use of it.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, so I understand that, what you're saying. Yeah, it's part of like production, the culture of production, or that we're all called on to do as neoliberal subjects, like produce. We all need to be generative, entrepreneurial subjects, right? So yeah, in that sense, I see the problem with that term. I'm obviously thinking about the juris generative in my reading of it or my usage of it in a different way, and I'm acknowledging the juris generative, this idea that Fred Moten is the key theorist for me here, even though it's Robert Cover who really develops this term. It comes out of Latin though, but the way Moten deals with it, I think, is also acknowledging its the fact that it doesn't necessarily have an attachment to value, whether it's good or bad, the kind of principles it generates. But he, in his work and his own case studies, what he wants to use it in reading through, I think definitely are sites of the formation of like racial justice, of escaping from the neoliberal principles of not only racial exclusion, but increasingly, as he talks about, racialized inclusion, right? But now maybe we're going back with Trump to a new period of unapologetic racial exclusion once again. So the jurist generative in his reading would be opposed to that, right? This would be a site of fugitivity, of attempting to escape from conditions of institutionalization, which are racializing, but also internalizing us within capitalism, most fundamentally. So that's the kind of jurist generative that I want to work with. And ultimately, I would see this, okay, what I'm presenting, what I'm talking about may be very ambiguous. It might come off as very ambiguous. I think it's a site of struggle. And here I would come down to like a fundamental kind of historical materialist position. Like, what justice means is a site of class struggle. It's a site of also decolonization and anti-racist abolition ecology. It's a practice and something that we can't rely on. There's no guarantees, but it's mobilized in these practices, and this is why I want to call attention to them and amplify them. It's an attempt to struggle with conditions of profound oppression and its history and injustice and violence. So for me, while I acknowledge justice also can be co-opted by neoliberalism, it's through these situated practices that the meanings become more clear, even if we can't fully say, finally, this is what it means. Because there's always possibility of more, but that's just the structural condition of justice, like it is with art. It can't, there's no final analysis that pins it down.
Yes, germination is probably a better word.
Germination, yeah.
Yes, that's
germinative.
as a synonym of a decolonizing practice. So I think we have to close the discussion now because we have to leave the building, but we can maybe have a small talk outside in campo, as we say here in Venice. So thank you so much, TJ. And we hope to have you back in Venice very soon. So we wait for you again.
Thank you very much.